Well, I'm very pleased to be with you for this event. My name is Raewyn Connell. I'm speaking to you by a video recording from Sydney in Australia on the far side of the Pacific Ocean on a cold winter evening in our part of the Southern Hemisphere. So now I want to talk a little bit about the implications for masculinity, about the background conditions for the new authoritarianism, which also bring us to issues about men and masculinity, and finally return to the theme of whether we're in a new era. So if we put together, and here I'm going way beyond the immediately available data to speculate a little. If we put together a kind of ideal type of the masculinity that fits these different movements, parties, and men's spaces that I've been talking about, I think it would look something like this. It's a masculinity which is hard rather than soft and communicative, which is, I mean, there are forms of hard communication, of course, but which is not emotionally communicative, if you like. A masculinity which is very definitely combative, and a masculinity which is dominant, which wishes to be on top of hierarchies, feels comfortable with hierarchies, especially provided that it's on top. The combativeness is important because part of the tone, part of the emotional tone and imagination of what the world is like that we find in the new authoritarianisms is that the world is a place of endless struggle. There are always enemies out there, which we have to combat constantly, endlessly. And those enemies may be other races, like maybe blacks for racists in the United States or in South America. They may be another religion, like the Muslims are for the Hindutva movement in India, or there may be the infidels from the point of view of the Islamist movements. They may be the migrants from the point of view of the right-wing movements in Europe, and to some extent in the United States too. But whoever they are, we've always got enemies. We always have to be mobilized and willing to fight them. So there's hence the militaristic kind of imagery that is constantly coming out in a variety of ways in these movements. Now, this implies a certain kind of gender order, a certain arrangement of gender relations. In particular, it's keeping women in their place. And Andrew Tate, of course, is a spectacular example of that kind of language, keeping women down and manipulating and dominating women. Well, often it's not as crude as that, but there's something like that going on in much of this world. And keeping gay men out entirely, totally delegitimating gay men, so that the attempts to outlaw gay marriage, although the legislation applied just as much to lesbian women, was totally dominated by hostile imagery of gay men. On the other hand, the ideal type of masculinity in authoritarian movements has something to admire, a number of things to admire. So there will be, characteristically, there will be admiration for powerful people, other powerful people, hopefully. There will be admiration for wealth. And this is really interesting because it often jars against a populist kind of rhetoric where you're against the elites. And Donald Trump sometimes talks this kind of language. Other authoritarians use it more. But it's tricky trying to present yourself as anti-elites when you've got Elon Musk sitting in your cabinet with you, when you've got other billionaires sprinkled around your regime or cheering for you from the sidelines through the media and so forth. So there's often, I think, admiration for wealth as well as power. And of course, there's admiration for high technology stuff, for flying into space, for having the most powerful computers, the most cryptic cryptocurrency, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, if that rings a bell, hold it in mind. I want to come back to that ideal type in a moment, but before doing that, I want to reflect on some of the deep background conditions for this model of masculinity to surface and become prominent, and for the political and economic shifts that we've been talking about. Okay, I want to speak of three background conditions. One I've already named and will be extremely familiar to you, and that's the rise of a neoliberal organization of the economy. With its deregulation, its abandonment of progressive taxation, shift to indirect taxation that bears most heavily on the poor, and so forth. And now we've had neoliberalism as the dominant economic form for 30 or 40 years. We can actually go back to the late 1970s, I guess in Chile, for the actual beginnings of the manifestation of neoliberal economic policy. It's been that long. We're now seeing effects, and those effects are now widespread and very much visible. One of them is mass precarity, the growth of precarious employment, of outsourcing, of various forms of the so-called gig economy or gig employment, which is very familiar in many parts of the post-colonial world, mass precarity, but is now also a feature of the economies of rich countries, including rich countries in the periphery like Australia. But at the same time, and very strikingly, there's a new level of concentration of wealth. We've never had such a concentration of wealth at the very top of wealth distributions than we've had now. And these now are conditions that exist in different forms, in different patterns, in many parts of the world, and are part of the background to the rise of authoritarian political movements, in the view of many, many analysts, including me. It's not surprising, given the both deregulation and extreme concentrations of wealth, that there's also a rise in corruption, and that many of these, or a number of these more established authoritarian regimes are now often spoken of as kleptocracies, where the political elite and their cronies in business, are now massively wealthy, although the details of their wealth are usually kept very, very secret. That's very strikingly the case in China, it's more obviously the case in Russia. I would say by now it is distinctly the case in India as well. And it is emerging in the United States, but hasn't developed quite so far. So that's one deep background pattern that leads into the authoritarian turn. Secondly, I would point to the situation, what I would call the post-imperial situation, the post-colonial situation, probably more common way of putting it. In the mid-20th century, more than half the world's population achieved a kind of autonomy from imperialist, direct or indirect imperialist control. Most spectacularly in South Asia and East Asia and Africa, parts of the Caribbean as well. So there was a huge expectation that this great wave of national liberation would lead to transformations in the lives of the formerly colonized people. And in much of the world, that has not happened. There's been deep political disillusion with many of the post-colonial regimes. Similarly, there's been deep disillusion with many of the development agendas that were adopted initially by post-colonial regimes or regimes that have been independent for longer, especially in South America, but which were intersected. The state-based development agendas eventually intersected with the turn to neoliberalism and petered out. At the same time, however, we've had disillusionment in the global north, in the old imperial powers, with the centrist, if you like, liberal regimes that seem to be pretty solidly in control in North America and Western Europe in the mid-20th century, having just won with the aid of Stalin, having just won the war, and their regimes were consolidated in a long economic boom through the 1950s and 60s. But after that, began to come unstuck, quite seriously unstuck, to the point where we have the really striking level of distrust of established parties and old established regimes at present. And finally, coming right back to the topic of masculinity and gender relations, if you like, deep condition for the new authoritarianism, I think, is disruptions in what I would call social embodiment. It manifest as disruptive changes in the gender order of many societies around the world. The advent of a new feminism, the women's liberation movement, the global feminisms that arose through the 1970s and 1980s, most of which didn't call themselves women's liberation, part of the same shift, which has produced, for instance, a huge global change in levels of literacy among women, levels of educational participation among girls, levels of economic participation in the paid employment on the part of women. Those are among the most spectacular social changes in the world over the last 50, 60, or 70 years. We've had I think in a number of ways, the incoherence of patriarchal gender orders has been revealed. the impossibility of an unchallenged patriarchy going forward historically has come to be a condition of our lives. And that, I think, gives us a way of thinking about the degree of hysteria, I can't think of a better word for it, in the speech, in the public performances of a considerable number of the leaders of different forms of the new authoritarianism. We certainly see it in the manosphere. We see it in the speech of people like Trump. We see it in the outbursts of corporate executives like Musk. There is, I think, an emotional, a level of emotional disturbance here, which is very deep-seated and is deep-seated above all in the historic gains that women have made in the changing of patriarchy over the last 60 or 70 years. I can't prove that, but that's what I think. And I think we need to be thinking at that level of depth if we're to understand a phenomenon as large as the new authoritarianism. Well, so let me come back to the question that I posed in my title. Are we in a new era so far as masculinity is concerned? And here I come back to my ideal type of masculinity, which in various empirical forms seems to be widespread in the new authoritarianism. A sociological colleague of mine called Cardoso, whom you will know, when he was asked once by a journalist to comment on the new authoritarianism, remarked, "This is hardly a new phenomenon." And I have to say, in terms of the model of masculinity, he's right. The ideal type of masculinity that I drew from the new authoritarianism is very like the ideal type of masculinity that was drawn on commentators on first wave fascism 100 years ago, or 90 or 100 years ago. It's very like the ideal model of masculinity in the fascist movement in Italy that began the European fascist movements. We see it very explicitly in Nazi movements, and it filters through with various national variations, of course. But this model of masculinity is not new. It exists in new conditions. It takes new political forms. The movement that I mentioned in India, the RSS, the Hindutva militia, actually dates from the 1920s. It was actually a pro-fascist movement then. But of course, the new generation were not around at that time, but the ideology goes back that far. So from that point of view, this is nothing terribly new in terms of the picture of masculinity. And just as fascism was actually defeated in the war, and then petered out in the fascist regimes which had the sense not to go to war, i.e. in Spain and Portugal. The contemporary forms of authoritarian also are vulnerable. Many commentators on the new authoritarianism seem to present it as if it's unstoppable, that if it's a worldwide movement which has risen and risen and risen, kept on rising. And certainly it's had spectacular successes, but it's also had failures. And we should take note of that. We really should. This is vulnerable. Bolsonaro, of course, lost his election. Assad has recently lost power completely in military conflict. The Law and Justice Party, which was moving in the direction of authoritarian regime in Poland, also lost the last election. And in my little, very remote country of Australia, the right-wing parties, which were just beginning to turn towards Trump in this country and to reproduce some of the memes of Trump-style authoritarianism, has just spectacularly lost a national election. And the commentators are saying one of the reasons for that is that they have moved towards a model, a political model, which is highly unpopular with the ordinary people of the country. And it seems something like that happened in Canada too, quite recently in their national election, where a right-wing party beginning to move in the Trump style was significantly, unexpectedly defeated. So the new authoritarianism is vulnerable in various ways. It won't be, there isn't an election that you're going to win in China or Russia, of course. But there's enough of this happening, enough of the new authoritarian campaigns have been lost, not just elections, also referenda, for instance, to make me think that what's going on is not an unstoppable surge or a new power in the world, but a struggle which has an ebb and flow, and to a very large extent is a struggle for hegemony, in which, in gender terms, there is also a struggle for the definition of a hegemonic masculinity going on, in which different constructions of masculinity are claiming legitimacy, claiming a central position. But that struggle is not yet won by the authoritarians in a decisive way, I think. You can have an authoritarian regime that comes to power through democratic means and then entrenches itself as a dictatorship. And that, in a sense, is what happened in Russia. It's happening, as far as one can tell, in Hungary. It seems to have failed in Poland. But the understanding what's going on, not as the unstoppable rise, but as a continuing struggle for hegemony, I think helps make sense of features of authoritarian language, of the importance of the image of the enemy, of the importance of the enemies, to mobilize movements and present oneself as strong and powerful. This is also a clue to the fact that there really is a struggle going on in much of the world. And another feature of authoritarian language is also, I think, a very striking indication of this, and that's the extent to which these movements constantly present themselves as the underdog, even when they're in power. They keep presenting themselves as the underdog and say, we are fighting against the system, against the elite, against the deep state, to use the United States extreme rights terminology. And that struggle does involve, very much involve, struggle over definitions of masculinity. And that leads me to the point at which you'll be pleased to know I'm going to finish, which is that if one is engaged in that struggle and not just looking on from an academic point of view, It reinforces the need for democratic models of masculinity, for models of masculinity that are emotionally satisfying as much as being involved in the authoritarian struggle seems to satisfy men engaged in the right-wing movements I've been talking about. Forms of masculinity that are emotionally satisfying, that are connected with practical purposes in the world, that are not just cultural, not just reconfigurations of identities or ideas, but actually have a payoff in ways of living, in economic activity, economic arenas, as well as domestic and emotional. Now we have many sources for work developing democratic models of masculinity, I think. There are social movements involved in a variety of parts of the world, urging, for instance, the greater involvement of men in childcare, which has turned in some countries, such as all the Scandinavian countries, into economic support for fathers to be involved in the care of young children. We have debates that have come, ideas that have come out of feminist movements about more sustainable and more equitable, fair families, families with an equal distribution of domestic labor, with support for careers of multiple caregivers, and so on. We have movements for cooperative forms of production, which don't need the managerial hierarchies that are one of the sources of modern authoritarianism. And we have men who are engaged with feminism, which was also a very distinct no in authoritarian movements, but which is a presence, it is a fact. That very large numbers of men, if you ask them in a survey whether they support feminist principles, listing the feminist principles, they will say yes. So there's an astonishing number of men who will support feminist positions, at least in abstract terms, according to the surveys, and who at least in over time are potential allies for democratic gender relations, for movements to develop democratic gender relations. So those are my thoughts on the theme. I hope that you will be engaging in your further discussions, especially with the theme I've ended on, and that is the democratic potentials in patterns of masculinity and life practices for different groups of men. So at that point, I'll leave you, and I hope we have not gone on disastrously too long.